Good morning, everyone. Good to be here. I'll talk today a bit about tools in beef cattle breeding, things that you can use. This is related to my research. This isn't directly the research I'm doing here at the station, but if folks want to hear more about that, I'm happy to tell you more about the kind of research I'm doing here. Most of what I'm doing on the farm is related to trying to understand what makes cattle genetically more resistant or tolerant to toxic fescue, and I can tell you more details about that after the talk if you'd like to hear about it. So, wanted to start out by giving you an overview, tell you about the topics I'm going to discuss today. I wanted to really put out a set of general tools that are useful in breeding. You folks have probably heard of a number of these, but if you haven't, I'll try to give you more detail on each of them. This is coming from a commercial beef producer standpoint, so if you're a purebred breeder, some of these guidelines that I give you may be slightly different. I'll point out one or two specifically related to genomics. Probably a lot of folks have heard about different companies selling genetic testing methods and genomic testing. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then I've left plenty of time for questions if you've got specific things you want to talk about. So we'll talk first about expected progeny differences, or EPDs. That's probably the tool that most of you have heard about the most. We'll talk about crossbreeding, which is really a nice and relatively simple way to reap a lot of benefit in your genetic management plan. Genomic selection, which is using the new genotyping tools and DNA information to try to predict how well your animals are going to do, and that's especially useful for selecting herd bulls potentially, or bulls you're going to use, and if you've got enough animals for replacement, selecting female animals. We'll talk a little bit about genetic defects, a little bit about sorted semen, where it's available, where it might be useful. I'll tell you a little bit about the future, not necessarily saying what's good or bad, but telling you what's on the horizon, and give some thoughts, at least in my opinion, of what I think's worth your investment today. So the first thing I want to say is please do stop me with questions if you have any. Hopefully I won't be putting you to sleep. Hopefully that won't be this scenario, but please grab me if you've got any questions anytime. So to start out, as I mentioned, I want to talk about EPDs first. And for those of you who are familiar with this, it's a bit of a review, but you can think of an EPD as a score that gives you a way to prioritize what bull is best for a single trait. So again, thinking about single traits with most EPDs. So I'm just throwing up a breed example. I'm not endorsing any specific breeds, but I'll give you some examples here. So we've got a Hereford bull on the left-hand side here for you folks that has an EPD for weaning weight of 35 pounds, plus 35, and on the right, one that has an EPD of plus 55 pounds. So on average, due to genetics, we expect this bull, let's see, please, on the right, to have calves that are about 20 pounds heavier just due to his genetics. So that's a tool, obviously, that can be very useful. We can select our bulls over time based on that. With herd bulls, obviously, we're picking younger animals, and there's some challenges associated with that, with the accuracy in their EPDs, but we'll talk about how genomics might be able to help out with that in a bit. So I just introduced a new term, and that's accuracy. And what I like to tell folks is that this is a way of assessing your risk and how to decide how much of a bull you want to use. So for instance, for these two bulls, let's say that this bull with a plus 35 EPD, he's 20 pounds less for his EPD than the bull on the right, but notice the accuracy in this example. The bull on the left with the lower EPD has a higher accuracy than the one on the right. Now that doesn't mean you want to avoid this one on the right. In fact, when his EPD was calculated, it was penalized for that lower accuracy. So the fact that his genetic merit is still that high is pretty impressive. So what this means is that you want to sort your risk. You don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. You do want to use this bull, you just don't want to breed him to all your cows. So if you've got a small herd, you might not have the benefit of doing this. If you've got a couple of herd bulls that you're picking and you've got an assortment of EPDs and accuracies, you can take advantage of using this information to help you sort out which bulls you want to use. And of course, if you're using AI, then this is a really important tool that you can use to help you kind of spread your risk, not to avoid an animal with a lower accuracy, at least one that's above 0.5 or 0.4, but it allows you to spread your risk out across your matings that you're doing. So how best to use EPDs in picking your herd bulls, just kind of a wrap up on these thoughts. Pick your herd bulls with the highest EPDs for the traits that you're most interested in. If for a bull you can get a genomic evaluation, that's better because that'll help with getting a better accuracy of prediction on those animals. If you're using AI bulls, that'll yield the greatest genetic progress, but I do fully realize that not every system is set up to use AI. If you have to make a choice, if you want to start using AI, the place to do it is in your heifers. That'll have the greatest impact. Those are your youngest animals, and your youngest animals are pushing the genetics forward the fastest. So that's where you'll make the biggest influence. And just as an example, and it's not necessarily pertaining strictly to AI, but in this case it's best suited for AI since the top bulls are AI bulls. If you pick the top 25% of Angus AI bulls for the dollar wean calf index, they would be at minimum about $13.47 more profitable than a herd bull, assuming that herd bull is breed average for AI bulls, and that's quite an assumption. In reality, those herd bulls are never going to be that good. So you can potentially make a lot of progress by selecting on an EPD or a selection index, which I'll talk about in the next slide, which combines multiple EPDs together. So all of that said, don't ignore your breeding soundness exams and your structural soundness. Obviously, all that stuff's important. If you don't have a bull that can breed your cattle, you're not going to get anything done. So I mentioned selection index. So selection index now is instead of taking single traits like we would have with EPDs and putting them together. And so they're available for most of the major breeds. Nice thing about index is it allows you to rank best bulls and cows on several traits and often on a dollar value. So instead of thinking about this bull having a certain advantage to another bull based on whatever the measurement is, say pounds of weaning weight or pounds of yearling weight, in this case you're actually doing it on profit. So you can put it into a dollar value for the lifetime of that animal. So I wanted to give you an example of what that means. So I took again this Angus wean calf dollar index. And so all of the traits that are included in that include weaning weight, birth weight, maternal milk production, and then mature cow size to include the cow's impact on that performance and the value of the calf and its actual energy intake and expense in terms of feed. So it's useful for production of calves sold at weaning. So here's two bulls. Bull A has a selection index value of $100, bull B $50. And what that means is that in this case, if you compare those two bulls to decide which one you wanted to use, calves of bull A are expected, calves of bull A are expected to be on average about $50 more profitable than that of bull B. So it's a nice way to put things in terms of a real economic value in your particular enterprise. So shifting gears from using these statistical approaches to identify animals that are best, let's talk a bit about crossbreeding. So probably most folks are pretty familiar with it. What's the value from heterosis and what can we gain from it? So heterosis is this idea that we cross two different breeds together that are complementary, maybe one that's really good on the beef grid and one that's good for maternal traits or whatever particular combination that we're looking for in our cows to produce good calves. And so we can produce cows, for instance, that have really good maternal traits, and actually that's where most of the value is in heterosis. About 2/3 of the value that we capture is in producing good mama cows that wean heavier calves, have better fertility and last longer, so we're replacing them less. And then about 1/3 of our value comes in if we add another terminal sire, for example, a third breed cross, such that all of our crossbred mama cows get bred to a different breed to produce faster growing calves that are going to go to the packing plant. So in reality, if you want to do both of these things, it's pretty hard if you have a small herd. There are some things out there that can help you. You might be able to use sex semen, but that costs a little bit of money. You give up a little bit on fertility, and I'll come back and talk about that in a bit. If you've got a bigger herd, this is something that you can potentially do and manage, and by bigger I mean hundreds to 1,000 plus cattle. With a smaller herd, your best bet is to work on that maternal heterosis side, because that's where you're going to get the most value, and it doesn't take quite as much input. Not to say that it doesn't take some work, but it's a little bit less intensive than having to manage 2 different or 3 different sets of bulls. So as an example of what you can gain from doing this, I heard a really good little story put together by Dr. Bob Weaver from Kansas State. And so he did some economic analysis and found that for a 100 cow herd over a 10-year time period with an average weaning weight of 575 pounds, that due to crossbreeding alone, you can wean about 103,000 to 104,000 more pounds of beef over that 10-year time frame. That's the equivalent of weaning about 18 more calves per season and about $264 more profitability per head over the purebred animals. To put that in a different frame of thought, think about it like this. That would be enough increased profit under the current cattle markets, and probably even if it dropped a little bit, to get you the nicest tricked out diesel pickup truck you could probably imagine every 3 years and replace it just from implementing a crossbreeding system in your herd. So I thought that was a really nice example that Dr. Weaver put together, and I think it illustrates what you can do just with crossbreeding alone. So challenges and solutions, I already talked a little bit about managing different bull pastures, also generating your replacement cows. Depending on what your operation looks like, it may be easier or harder to generate those first cow cross where you've got two purebreds that are producing your offspring. In terms of managing multiple purebred sire pastures, obviously that can be a bit of a challenging. Also, there are no EPDs for crossbred cattle. So once we've got crossbred animals, if we wanted to ever breed with crossbred animals, we don't have any genetic information per se on them directly. Although in an ideal crossbreeding system, we should be working with purebreds to always be producing the crossbred mamas and then the crossbred calves that we're going to sell to market. Some possible solutions, I mentioned before sex semen, or some people call it gender sorted semen. But it's not available for all breeds. It can cost a little bit more. Sometimes people claim the fertility is a little bit less on it, but I think that's mostly an issue if you're ever doing embryo transfer work. You can use EPDs for the purebred bulls, so when you're picking out your parents to make the crossbreds, you can still use that information to select animals for the best traits that you're interested in, or use a selection index to pick those purebred bulls. And you can maybe, if you're lucky, find some place to contract replacement heifers. That would be a potential solution to overcome where those females are coming from if you want to get crossbred mama cows to work with. But all of these things obviously vary depending on where you are and what your local market looks like. So shifting gears from some of the traditional kind of animal breeding tools, I want to tell you about what folks are getting into a lot today. So genomic selection or genomic testing, genotyping, some folks may have heard about. The idea that we're using DNA information to predict the genetic merit of our bulls and cows, and particularly to select our bulls. And so on the right, I've got a picture of a SNP chip. So this thing is about the size of a microscope slide, and you're testing anywhere between 10,000 and 150,000 different locations in the bovine genome to identify what regions are associated with traits of interest. And so in many of the livestock species, this is really revolutionizing genetic improvement. In the beef industry, we're a little bit behind, but we're catching up pretty quickly. Angus Association, Simmental Association, Hereford, I'm trying to think of who else. There are a number of different breeds that have started adopting this, and more with breed associations having to accommodate more than one breed or crossbred animals, what we're seeing is that genomic breeding values are getting generated for many of the animals across many different breeds that are available. So why would we ever want to do this? Well, it can greatly improve your ability to select young animals, and particularly since breed associations are including these in EPDs, if you're looking at a herd bull, and the place where you're going to look at a herd bull by chance has done some genomic testing, you can use that information to enhance the EPD information that you would have on that animal already. So typically if you're going to go get a herd bull, he may not have any progeny yet. In fact, he probably doesn't if you're buying a young bull. With genomic information, what you're really doing is sharing or grabbing information from the rest of the population and using statistics and DNA information to say, hey, this young bull has a similar pattern to older bulls that performed really well. And based on that information, we can say that that young bull is much more likely to perform well in your herd. That increases our accuracy of selection and lets us do a better job of picking younger animals. Picking younger animals that are more genetically superior is the fastest way that we can improve our genetic improvement. Another thing that it does is it gives us a way to select females. So there are some companies out there that are marketing some tests If folks have specific questions, I can tell you what I know about those, but I'll tell you that DNA at least is now giving us a new way to evaluate those females. Obviously it takes a long time to generate calves on those animals and to get data back on those cows, and we can't produce hundreds or thousands of offspring, even tens of animals on those cows like we can on our bulls. So this is a way that we can accelerate our selection in females and really do something meaningful up front, potentially allowing you to remove one female and keep another in the herd that might be more profitable. New products have been developed also to evaluate crossbred cattle. That's something that we haven't been able to do so well with traditional EPDs and selection index. There have been some conversion factors that were developed by USDA that are available, but I think perhaps genomic testing may provide a better way in the future to help select crossbred cattle. In terms of cost, we're somewhere between $25 and $60 per animal. At a commercial level, you may not be able to always afford this, although I would say if you're going to go and use it, your herd bulls are a good place to use it. Maybe some of your females, if you've got older cow, well, especially with your younger animals before you're getting them into the herd. If you're a purebred breeder, you might want to spend the extra money for a little bit more in-depth panel that tests more of these genetic markers throughout the genome and can potentially give you a little bit more information, but for most folks I think $150 per animal is cost prohibitive. So I want to sort out one thing. Folks I think hear about genomic testing and then this genomic selection, which is this idea of picking animals using the SNP chip for the ones that perform better or the others based on whatever trait it may be. Then there's genetic defect testing, which is actually a separate thing, and that can be a byproduct of the genomic selection kind of testing that we're doing. The general idea is that we're going to genotype our bulls and we're going to try to determine which ones carry various genetic defects. And so you may have a bull that carries one broken gene, if you will, or one copy of a gene from either its mother or its father that causes calves to die early or to undergo abortion such that you never get calves. And so the way that works is if you've got a carrier bull and you breed him to your cows and you assume your cows don't carry this bad mutation, you'll get about 50% of the animals that are free of the mutation and about 50% that carry it. So in the next generation, 50% of your cows could be at risk if you breed them to another bull that carry that same broken gene. That could lead to dead calves. So in that case, say you've got now a carrier cow here and you mate those carrier cows to carrier bulls, you'll still end up with about 25% that will be free and clear of that mutation. You'll generate 50% again that carry that mutation and will be at risk in the next population, and then you'll lose about 25% of your animals, say to stillbirth or to abortion, for instance. Although there are other types of defects, and I'll show you for a moment. So this is where, if we've got some genomic information, that can really help out to say which bulls we want to keep around and not use. I will point out it's important to know which animals carry the genetic defects and to be able to manage that to prevent mating those carrier bulls to other carriers in your herd. But just because you've got a carrier animal doesn't necessarily mean you want to get rid of it immediately. It may mean you want to get rid of it sooner. It just means you need to manage it. So I wouldn't always say that that's a loss, especially in your cow population. I wouldn't say that's a loss, but if you've got a big enough group of cattle, what you can do is swap out that bull in about the same kind of time frame that you normally would, around 3 years or so, put in a new bull and move forward. Most important is to have your herd bull tested and to know that carrier cows and bulls, if you've got a big enough herd, you can keep them around, but if you've got a smaller herd, that may not be feasible and you might want to use that information to move animals out sooner. I wanted to show a couple of examples of defects. Defects don't happen just in Angus, but there happen to be a couple of high-profile ones recently. So developmental duplication, this animal on your left, is a type of defect where animals have a set of extra legs that almost look like they're flopping off the back of their neck. Sometimes they look like they're coming out of their shoulder. It's a very strange defect. This doesn't necessarily mean that the animal dies, but most of the animals that have this, 2 copies of this mutation to generate this phenotype actually never make it to birth. So odds are if you're seeing one at birth, you probably lost some animals due to abortion already. The one on the right is called curly calf, and this is one that went through Angus a while ago and is getting worked out. But these animals were typically born dead, and they looked like they were literally curled up in a ball. As I said before, genetic defects exist in all breeds. They're running around, I know, in Simmental and Hereford, and really they're in just about every animal out there. With the advent of DNA sequencing these days, we know that every bull's got somewhere between 20 and 50 broken genes in them. And for the most part, they survive, but they've probably also got another 20 or 50 where they're carrying one copy of a broken gene. And if you've got 2 copies of those together, those might be the ones that end up leading to stillbirth or early abortions. So even if you're thinking about a bull that doesn't necessarily carry a specific mutation, that's one of the important reasons why you want to make sure to turn your herd bulls over in a timely manner, because odds are if you keep them around too long and you start getting matings of either sires to daughters or sires to close relatives, you're going to start creating calf survival problems and fertility problems. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today was what does the future hold? And more to kind of inform you about what's going on. I think for a long time people thought that transgenics and anything that led to genetically modified livestock was panacea. It wasn't going to happen. It's happened. So folks may be aware that genetically modified salmon was approved by FDA late last year, and with that opened the box for starting to develop more genetically altered livestock. And so I'm not saying this is the best way to go forward, but this is kind of more letting you know I think you're going to see this sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. There are somewhere between 16 and 20 genetically altered livestock animals, or I should say projects that are ongoing at several locations throughout the world. This one's at California Davis, and in this example, this is a dairy example, but you could imagine doing something similar in beef or changing a different trait. But in this case, we're talking about polled. You've got a horned Holstein on your left side, and on the right side, you've got essentially clones of those animals where the horns have been removed by creating a mutation that occurs in Italian cattle. So this isn't creating anything new. This is a mutation that existed in nature, and this has been the strategy of what folks doing gene editing have been talking about, is taking existing DNA variation and moving it from one breed to the other, and instead of taking 20 or 50 or 100 years to move that over with traditional breeding and improve those genetics to make them profitable, they're using tools in the lab to create animals that have this one change and all of the other favorable genetic effects that would have taken many years to breed for. This project is going on, I think I mentioned before, at California Davis. They're going to breed these bulls and make sure that those animals produce viable offspring. But there are many other projects in the wings, and many of them focus on animal welfare. Many of the projects that these groups are trying to say are good are the ones where we can make animals that have less pain issues, less issues with stress, etc. In part, I think, as a marketing kind of a tool to try to make people feel that this is okay. And in part, I think also as a means to potentially drastically change the genetics such that you can go from an animal that maybe was really, really genetically superior but had that one bad trait or one bad phenotype for a trait that you didn't like, and suddenly change it into what you want. How well is this going to work? How good is this going to work? Well, that's the research that's going on now. So time will tell us, but this is something kind of interesting that I think will be coming around sometime in the near future. A couple of last thoughts, and then I need to wrap up. Some folks asked me, what's the best breed or cross in Arkansas? I don't think there is any best breed. I think it's what suits your management system the best, and I think most folks can make a lot of different breeds work in your system. I might not recommend a Scottish Highlander around here, but I think a lot of other breeds can work. And I mean, I think you know from common sense what works and what doesn't work. A lot of how cattle perform obviously is still based on farm management and nutrition. For most traits, genetics controls a portion of what you're doing, and it can make a big impact. Like I mentioned with crossbreeding, you can add a lot of profitability. Using EPDs, you can add a lot of profitability, but genetics only go as far as the management is there to help them out. And so with my last point, cattle with better genetics are more profitable in well-managed enterprises. Cattle with good genetics and less well-managed enterprises do okay, but they don't do nearly as well, or they're not nearly as profitable. Some last comments on selection using EPDs. Again, you know your production system and your pastures best. You might not want to select that highest growth animal to go out and be on grass pasture 300 days of the year. That might not work out so well. So, as I mentioned, take a note from the dairy industry. High milking cows tank if they don't have good nutrition. You can't put a Ferrari out to run it and give it whiskey to run on. You've got to give it good fuel. So if you're going to have good cattle for your particular condition, keep in mind what your nutrition is. You might not want to select on the highest growth or the absolute most extreme if you know that your nutrition can't support it. If you're willing to feed them and you can cost it out to feed them and be profitable, then this is the way to go, but that's not always the case. And so obviously producers need to use those genetic tools that best fit their enterprise. My take-home message, selecting bulls with expected progeny differences or EPDs or selection indexes maximize profitability. And for herd bulls, genomic testing can be really valuable if you can get that information to pick your bull when you're going out to buy a new one. Evaluate your herd bulls for genetic defects. That can cost you a lot of money. Best thing to do is when you buy your bull, try to make sure that it's either got a genetic test or look through at the pedigree and make sure that there are no bulls that have been red flagged by your breed association as a potential carrier. That's a good place to start a lot of time before investing in that genetic test. Using crossbreeding can really improve your profitability, and as I showed before, that can have a big impact over the years. And looking to the future, genomic selection is a really powerful tool. It's going to impact more and more what you're doing every day, the bulls that are available from AI and even herd bulls. And I think the ability to use that to select replacement heifers could be of real value even for smaller producers when used periodically in their herds. With that, I'll open up the floor to questions, and thank you for your attention.
You were suggesting on the crossbreeding then,